I was 10 years old when I first played Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare in 2007. Like millions of other kids around the world, it quickly became one of the video gaming pillars of my childhood and the start of my decade-long addiction to Call of Duty. Its single-player campaign was exactly the kind of modern military fantasy that was right up my alley. And, like many others, I was utterly mesmerized by its 13th mission, All-Gilead-Up. Playing it for the first time, it was something I had never experienced before in video games up to that point. Whereas the British campaign would often entail surgical strikes in small villages, the American campaign with large mechanized battles in urban cities, the Pripyat missions were totally unique in both level design and in gameplay. While previous levels in Call of Duty 4 would feature some light stealth sequences, they were never designed as a serious challenge for the player. Instead, they only offered brief opportunities to sneak up behind guards and take easy headshots, and then defaulted back to all-out combat when that silence was inevitably broken by me or the level scripting. However, in All-Gilead-Up, without automatic weapons, grenade launchers, air support, or a squad to back me up, I was in an overwhelming situation that was firmly outside my control. Instead of just shooting whatever was in front of me, I was suddenly asked to manage patrols and sight lines, using my ghillie suit to literally immerse myself in the dry grass. I had to make decisions on whether to patiently crawl past enemies, or to silently eliminate them while keeping their bodies out of sight. Or, perhaps completely foregoing stealth, to face off against enemy reinforcements using optional weapon caches found in the environment. Even though I could still feel the designers directing me towards a linear path, there was enough leeway for me to deviate and experiment, and allow the world to naturally react to my actions. Of course, there were still very practical limits on how much Infinity Ward could accomplish with the limited time and resources at their disposal, but this one glimpse was already enough to expand my conception of what was possible within video games. All-Gilead-Up is also my first exposure to the Chernobyl exclusion zone as a setting. As a 10-year-old kid, I didn't really know what the 1986 disaster was exactly, and it'd be many more years until I fully appreciated the far-reaching consequences that it had left upon the real world. Call of Duty 4 just assumes your pop culture familiarity with Chernobyl right off the bat, and thus, I wasn't in any position to understand the context of what exactly I was seeing or why. I was simply left to experience the exclusion zone raw and unexpectedly, trampling past old farms and graveyards of people and vehicles alike, remaining absolutely still in the dry grass to hide from an entire tank platoon, walking amidst the quiet melancholy of a dead city, surrounded by the invisible death of radiation that seemed to be draining the very color out of the world until nothing was left but gray. It was also the first time that I experienced virtual architecture that was recognizably drawn from reality, like the Palace of Culture Energetique, the Azor swimming pool, the Ferris wheel, and the geographically inaccurate nuclear power plant located smack dab in the middle of Pripyat. I remember it struck me to discover afterwards how all the places that I explored were nearly identical to their real-world counterparts, which created an almost hyper-real sensation for me that this was an actual place out there in the real world. While my time in the zone may have been brief, it would nevertheless leave a lasting impression on my love of immersion video games that would follow me well into adulthood. Of course, I realize that it's difficult to come up with original perspective on immersion that hundreds of people have not already talked about in the past. The concept of creating impeccable simulations of reality has been a seductive ambition for designers, programmers, and engineers for over half a century. Many have tried to sell themselves, whether intentionally or not, on that romantic idea of immersion to varying degrees of success. But for me, it's equally hard to not talk about the effects that immersion has had upon my upbringing and outlook at what a video game should strive to become. While it is commonly understood as the sensation of being transported to a virtual world, immersion is a far more subjective and dynamic quality than that. It can be represented in a multitude of ways than any simple definition may imply. I see it in the rhythmic flow of Beat Saber, the abstract reasoning of The Witness, and the binaural soundscapes of Hellblade's Senua's Sacrifice. It's those magical moments when everything in the game wants to become just clicks for you, elevating it beyond the sum of its parts into something truly special. When you're totally absorbed in the atmosphere of ideas, themes, emotions, and experiences that developers want you to feel. This is the kind of immersion that I believe people truly mean when they talk about it, and it's the kind that I found when I first played the Stalker Trilogy developed by GSC Game World last year. It was remarkable for me to finally play the games that I understood what I had found so fascinating in Call of Duty 4 all those years ago, and with the upcoming release of its long-awaited sequel after a decade of dormancy, I want to examine exactly how the original trilogy defined immersion through the specific construction of its world design, its game design, and its narrative themes, and understand why Stalker managed to immerse me so strongly in the ways that it did. I was originally planning on making my first proper video essay to coincide with the April 28th release date of Stalker 2, Heart of Chernobyl, taking one last look back on the original trilogy before Stalker moves firmly towards the future. However, in January 2022, GSC announced that they were delaying the game 7 months to December 8th for polishing and bug testing. Given the tumultuous development history of the franchise in the past, I expected something like this would happen. I was even somewhat thankful, as it gave me more time to make this video the best that it possibly could be. And then, a month and a half after the initial delay, the worst thing that could possibly happen happened. As I am writing this sentence, Ukrainians are fighting for their right to exist on a scale of suffering and cruelty that they haven't known since the Second World War. Millions were forced to become refugees as they fled westward to safety in neighboring countries or elsewhere abroad. Those who remained in Ukraine have had to endure the horrors of modern war. Homes and neighborhoods destroyed by artillery and missile strikes. Loved ones tortured and murdered under the violent yoke of Russian occupation. The threat of further nuclear catastrophes on Ukrainian soil being used as bargaining chips. While the fate of the country is still hanging in the balance, video games have got to be the absolute least concern in the world right now. But remarkably, the men and women of GSC Game World are carrying on in spite of the hardships. The studio is temporarily relocated to Prague in order to continue development of Stalker 2 and hopefully release it within 2023. Some developers are staying behind in order to contribute to the war effort, and some have even volunteered for military service, putting their careers on hold and their lives on the line to defend their homeland. With the tremendous sacrifice and perseverance of Ukrainians going on right now, I think it's worth taking the time to remember the achievements of the original trilogy, and remembering what it meant to the developers who nurtured it and the players around the world who adored it. And hopefully one day, we will be able to play hard at Chernobyl and witness Ukraine emerge from this war as a peaceful, modern, and independent country. To preface, my footage of the Stalker trilogy was captured with Vanilla Plus mods that included engine optimizations, texture packs, and remodeled weapons and animations. Lists of the mods used in this video will be linked in the description below. I will also be discussing Shadow Chernobyl, Clear Sky, and Call of Pripyat as a collective whole rather than as separate installments, considering how they are all extremely similar to one another, built upon the proprietary X-Ray engine, all released within a year of each other, and only made incremental changes and additions on the core that made Stalker what it is today. The Chernobyl zone of alienation is thousands of square kilometers of wild forests, empty roads, and decrepit ruins. Villages that were once homes to happy families now remain abandoned, haunted by the long-forgotten memories of their former inhabitants. Statues and murals praising the Soviet Union and its hallowed leaders are all that remains of the once mighty global superpower. Radiation that cannot be seen, touched, or smelled, and can only be heard by the ticking of a Geiger counter that grows more violent the more dangerous it becomes. Supernatural anomalies corrupt the landscape with concentrated gravity wells, invisible spouts of fire, and powerful fields of static electricity. Colossal waves of psychic energy periodically wash across the landscape, while the howls of monsters and the dead can be heard in the distance. It's clear that GSC Game World took great care not only capturing the sights and sounds of the real-life exclusion zone, but also the intangible experience of immersing the player into that unnatural world. It expertly recreates the beautiful melancholy and otherworldly wonder that continues to make the zone such a fascinating place even to this day. From its decaying Soviet architecture to its realistic weather systems and its dark ambient soundtrack by Moose and Alexei Umolchuk, Stalker captures that visceral post-apocalyptic atmosphere that many modern games still struggle to achieve to the same effect. On the surface, Stalker can seem extremely barren for a modern open-world game. Points of interest are separated by long stretches of emptiness, and the only reliable means of traversal is hiking across the zone on foot. There are no activities to do, checklists to complete, collectibles to collect, vehicles to operate, or enemy outposts to liberate. There are very few human NPCs to interact with at any given time, and even fewer of them are friendly. But in spite of all that is seemingly missing, the trilogy still feels far more exhilarating to inhabit than so many of its contemporaries. The overabundance of things to do in modern open world games often deprive themselves of the intrinsic fun that their mechanics can potentially offer. Instead of taking in the unadulterated pleasures of discovering something new or overcoming a difficult challenge, those pleasures can become undermined by the external framework that gets built up around them, where you're preoccupied with turning into a human vacuum cleaner to mindlessly gather resources, or getting enough experience points to make your number slightly higher than the enemy's number, or clearing icons off a map to make it feel like you're making progress. It takes the core gameplay loops that make the game engaging and grinds them down to bland and tedious chores for the player, subsequently pulling them out of the game and damaging their immersion. Conversely, Stalker isn't meant to be treated like a playground with hundreds of activities, tasks, and collectibles to occupy yourself with. There's nothing superfluous or external to distract you from fully engaging with its core gameplay. Doing things in Stalker is always rewarding because everything is done for its own sake and the immediate consequences that it has on the world around you. It pushes you to be fully engaged in the moment at all times, thinking in immediate terms of exploring, fighting, and surviving however you can. Likewise, this kind of purity and focus also extends the design of the open world itself. The zone is not a true contiguous open world, but instead a series of smaller interconnected regions. While its primary function is obviously to preserve memory and performance, it also elegantly preserves the rich atmosphere that Stalker excels in. It's designed to be just large enough to encourage open-ended exploration, and yet small enough to slow down the pace and really soak in the world around you, chancing upon those accidental moments of discovery and self-reflection. Fleeting moments like gazing upon the Milky Way on a clear night, walking through the overgrown Jupiter factory, listening to the rain inside the Lemansk hospital, encountering a mysterious anomaly in the Red Forest, or simply sharing a campfire with your fellow stalkers. Atmosphere has always been one of the greatest strengths of Stalker, and can be felt not only in its audiovisual and world design, but also in how the players contextualize in relation to the NPCs around them. The AI is governed by the A-Life system, which controls the daily routines, behaviors, and relationships between different stalkers, factions, and mutants in the zone. NPCs can dynamically develop plans of action in order to achieve their goals, and constantly update them according to the ever-evolving game state. Neutral stalkers you come across will typically go about their own business, with whom you're able to trade, ask questions, assist them during combat encounters, or allow them to guide you to the nearest point of interest for a fee. But even when you don't directly interact with them, NPCs will continue to act on their own accord, whether to go searching for artifacts, hunting down mutants, or battling their rivals. Furthermore, A-Life is divided into two subsystems, online and offline behavior. When NPCs are outside your immediate proximity, or when you're not loaded into the same level as them, offline operation can still stimulate activity with random pathfinding and interactions until they go back to online operation. What results from A-Life is an ecosystem of artificial intelligence that enhances the zone into something that feels truly alive, even 15 years later. It creates opportunities for immersion storytelling born from those random encounters with NPCs, like defending the Skadovsk from a bandit attack, fighting for faction territory, joining some stalkers in an artifact hunt, or even watching a pack of wild dogs hunt down a limping boar in the distance. Even in story missions, friendly NPCs can die on you, either in the heat of battle or intentionally by your hand. Rather than the player being the center of gravity for everything that happens, they are instead treated as little more than an interloper, while the zone continues to thrive under its own power. In retrospect, it's remarkable how the programmers and designers at GSC Game World were able to achieve this level of complexity in their first major foray to the open world genre. However, much of the operation behind A-Life is often indirect and generally invisible to the player, and it doesn't take too long upon closer scrutiny for their shortcomings to become more apparent. While the macro interactions of A-Life spread out across the zone are quite impressive for the time, the micro interactions with individuals are woefully underdeveloped in their scope and impact in the games. Stalkers usually have nothing more than some food and less than a few hundred rubles to trade with in the open world. Dialogue options are mostly limited to flavor text and giving directions, and they are fully interactive elements, and their unrefined pathfinding can cause them to start bumping into geometry or start walking stupidly into enemy fire. It would take several years afterwards for modders to realize the full depth of the A-Life system, but to me, it doesn't particularly matter how robust or not the artificial intelligence actually is in Stalker. Like many other famous examples of AI in video games, from Pac-Man to Halo to Middle-earth, personality is far more important than complexity in making AI memorable and engaging. What is important is the overall impression that the trilogy suggests, a pseudo-life simulation where stalkers and mutants live their lives and can realistically interact with one another across a vast and dynamic virtual world. However, even so, there are certain cracks and faults in the games that can be almost impossible to ignore for some. Stalker is well known for its notoriously difficult development cycles, chiefly caused by inexperience and overambition for what they were initially trying to achieve in their first major blockbuster title. Combined with the budgetary limitations and hard deadlines imposed by the publisher THQ to finally finish the game, it caused Shadow of Chernobyl to suffer from poor optimization and technical issues that would be shared with the similarly rushed states of Clear Sky and Call of Pripyat. And in spite of unofficial fan patches that have fixed most of these issues, there's still a certain feeling of awkwardness that permeates the entire experience, from its accented English dubbing, to its inelegant character animations, to its steep difficulty curves, that official patches or fan mods could not fully rectify. For these reasons, Stalker has often been proclaimed as the definitive example of Eurojank in the popular discourse, an endearing if problematic label referring to middle-market European games with a disproportionate innovation and ambition as compared to production value and polish. Those who existed outside the realms of industry giants, especially those from the former Eastern Bloc, often didn't have the same tools, knowledge, or capital to pursue high-value presentation or mechanical perfection as compared to their Western counterparts. While the amateurish qualities of Stalker are certainly endeared as part of the charm and appeal of the trilogy, I would further argue that it is these idiosyncrasies that ironically contribute to its authenticity and immersion in two key respects. Firstly, the buggy and unstable state of the vanilla game sort of lend themselves toward reinforcing that supernatural atmosphere of the zone. For a game where psychic energy and mysterious anomalies are tearing the fabric of reality apart, it doesn't seem too uncharacteristic for to have dead bodies become temporarily transparent, NPC footsteps creating water ripples in the air, or corrupted audio files screeching in your ears, whether intentionally or not. Your personal tolerance for these issues may vary, but I think it fits neatly into the idea that the zone can be as unpredictable to you as it is to its inhabitants. And secondly, while most games want to be effortless to play in order to enjoy a brief interactive escape from reality, there is a distinct charm to games that embrace friction and inconvenience as part of the flavor of its gameplay. Goat Simulator didn't become successful because it was this polished and smooth experience. Instead, people were left alone to play with the wonky physics and collision detection, and exploiting the semi-intentional bugs and glitches for their own creativity and amusement. Scripting and set-piece design has created some absolutely glorious moments in gaming, but there is also something just as fascinating in witnessing the inelegance of game mechanics and systems operating in real time. It is far more exciting and enriching when things are happening not solely because some designer programmed it to happen that particular way, but because all the interlocking pieces of S.T.A.L.K.E.R are moving in harmony to make the zone feel like a believable place to inhabit, even if the duct tape that is holding it all together starts to come apart. Immersive sims, or at least the design philosophy behind them, have always been part of the DNA of S.T.A.L.K.E.R. When GSC rebooted Oblivion Lost in 2002 from a linear Half-Life clone to the open-world survival shooter known today as Shadow of Chernobyl, they took strong influence from the non-linearity and player freedom afforded by games like System Shock, Deus Ex, and Morrowind. By the dawn of the new millennium, these games and others like them were dramatically broadening the horizons of how far video games could go with immersion. By creating interconnected gameplay mechanics and systems, they allowed you to creatively solve problems and engage with the world however they saw fit. They were responsive to your actions and consistent to the logic of the world around them, thus encouraging you to fully embody yourself within the fiction of the game. And though I would personally hesitate to call the Stalker trilogy immersive sims in the strictest sense of the word, it still retains its core values of player agency and role-playing that allow you to fully embody the Stalker fantasy. There are small but noticeable gameplay details that help to sell this immersion, such as your PDA operating in real time instead of simply pausing the game, having sound and visibility meters to measure impact upon the game world, or even having stalkers refuse to talk to you until you holster your weapon. But the greatest immersive strength of Stalker's gameplay lies in how much the designers trust you to be independent without much direction or hand-holding, however tempting it may have been for them to do so. While there are some brief tutorials at the beginning of Shadow of Chernobyl that introduce basic things like crouching and jumping, the trilogy wastes little time in throwing you into the frying pan. You have to quickly learn from first-hand experience how to chart the safest path across the landscape, how to interact with the stalkers you come across, and how to handle dangerous situations. Alongside the A-Life system, it allows for a wide range of player-driven storytelling and how you choose to act and react to the world around you, whether to stay on a safe but beaten path towards your next objective, or to risk life and limb exploring the outskirts for artifacts and hidden caches, whether to confront a gang of bandits blocking your way, or to sneak around them and save your resources for more dangerous threats ahead, whether to save a group of stalkers from a pack of snorks, or to let them overwhelm the group in order to loot their remains without damaging your reputation with their faction. And that degree of independence is made all the more rewarding knowing that you are held accountable for determining your own fate, that there is nothing outside your direct control to protect you from all the hostile stalkers, mutants, anomalies, and radiation hotspots that are constantly out to kill you. Even the simple act of traversing from point A to point B is fraught with tension and difficulty, as the zone is covered with nearly invisible anomalies that require you to be tossing bolts to safely navigate the landscape. With how uncomfortably close you are to death at any given moment, it creates a kind of survival game atmosphere where you have to exercise caution towards everything that you do, including how you manage your resources and how you work the economy of the zone. Like Resident Evil, Stalker pushes you to make thoughtful decisions about what is worth carrying and what can be left behind. Each journey into the zone begins with a sort of preparation phase at a safe settlement, where you're gathering your supplies, repairing your equipment, and planning out your missions for the day. Because of your limited carrying capacity, you have to find the right balance of weapons, ammo, and supplies to prepare for a multitude of situations they may find yourself in, like having enough anti-rad drugs for artifact hunting, or AP rounds for well-armored stalkers, or a scoped weapon for long-range battles, while also accounting for any scavenged loot you come across and staying at or around 50 kilograms. The heavier your cargo is, the quicker your stamina depletes and the slower it recharges, which can sometimes mean the difference between life and death in the zone. While the limitations on carrying capacity and endurance can eventually be overcome in the late game through suit upgrades and artifacts, the trilogy nevertheless encourages you to be mindful in resource gathering, and proactive in anticipating whatever might come your way. While it is tempting to hoard as much as you can for that big payout at the nearest trader, Subsisting on stashes and dead stalkers is usually not enough to upgrade your equipment at a reasonable pace. Traders in Clear Sky and Call of Pripyat won't buy any of your weapons or suits in a less than pristine condition, requiring you to repair them at a local technician and offset the repair costs during trading. And depending on the quality of your loot and your reputation with certain traders, your payout can be marked down to as low as 10% of their retail price. Thus, outside of completing story missions, the most effective way of making money is by acquiring artifacts in the open world. While they are clearly visible within highly radioactive areas in Shadow of Chernobyl, the latter games make them invisible to the naked eye and nestle them deep within anomaly fields, requiring you to venture into them with your artifact detector to reveal them. Despite the extremely high danger involved, artifacts provide the highest selling price proportional to their weight, which makes them far more valuable than any scavenged loot you collect, as well as providing passive character buffs like elemental resistance or bleeding recovery to augment your chances of survival. Hunting for these objects can become quite the terrifying experience in their own right, walking blindly into danger while avoiding being burned, electrified, dissolved, or crushed to death. And because these activities are entirely optional, it adds another layer of player autonomy and tension whenever you decide to take the risk in searching for these artifacts out in the open world. However, what has contributed the most to the notoriety of the Stalker trilogy over the years is its punishing combat difficulty. Shadow of Chernobyl and Clear Sky starts you off with little more than a Makarov pistol or a sawn-off shotgun, a paper-thin leather jacket, and limited supplies against packs of bandits and flesh pigs within the first few minutes of gameplay. Weapons can be incredibly inaccurate with massive spreads, especially when firing an automatic across longer ranges, which can make it seem like enemies are seemingly absorbing dozens of bullets unfazed. However, even with military armor equipped, a single rifle burst can be enough to kill you, or at least cause severe damage and bleeding that must be immediately remedied with bandages and medkits. And as your weapons degrade from use over time, your inaccuracy gradually increases and become more likely to jam in the heat of battle, creating moments of panic once enemies begin closing in on your position. Playing on the second hardest veteran difficulty, the skill floor is definitely higher than one might expect and can make for an extremely punishing and obtuse experience, so much so that it has spawned pervasive myths about the true difficulty of Stalker, ranging from hit probabilities to bullet sponginess to damage buffs on higher difficulties, all of which have been thoroughly debunked over the years. Rather, the trilogy demands out of you something that closely resembles a tactical shooter discipline. With its pseudo-realistic ballistics model and lethality, it forces you to treat every combat encounter you come across seriously, from the lowliest of wild dogs to the deadliest of monolith soldiers. My first playthroughs, I found it remarkable when I noticed how much I was using the leaning keys to peek around corners, whereas in other FPS games I never even thought to bind them from how little I actually used them. But in Stalker, I found that leaning becomes essential in shooting accurately from cover, especially when facing shotgunners in close quarters or railgun snipers from a kilometer away. The unreliability of body shots to deal consistent damage anywhere beyond point-blank range encourages you to prioritize headshots whenever possible, making quick work of enemies while consuming as little ammo as possible. The trilogy also requires you to be aware of your movement, your posture, and your positioning in order to protect yourself in every firefight. You have to be vigilant in clearing rooms and checking corners, as there is nothing quite so tense in Stalker as anticipating ambushes around blind corners in the dark, being aware that even a moment's hesitation can lead to your sudden death. Of course, Stalker is nowhere near perfect. I can definitely still empathize and agree with many of the issues that people take over how obscure, arbitrary, and unfair the difficulty can be. It never goes deeper than the surface in capturing the depth of pure tactical shooters like Counter-Strike or Ghost Recon, and it can be infuriating in the moment when the game doesn't respond like it realistically ought to. The developers' first effort in attempting a truly realistic combat simulation as compared to their previous work, it's clear that a lot of deficiencies and issues were still left to be worked out. With the advantages of time and experience behind them, fan mods like Autumn Aurora 2 and Misery have come much closer in achieving those original ambitions, with more realistic ballistics modeled for damage, accuracy, and recoil. With all that said, however, I think the overall difficulty of the vanilla games nevertheless serves the broader objective of immersion throughout the Stalker trilogy. The confluence of tactical shooter and survival game design adds a flavor of realism to proceedings that goes a long way in reinforcing that omnipresent aura of danger and death. It recreates the feelings of lethality, unpredictability, and desperation that would normally be found in a more straightforward shooter, and it forces you to adapt to a different set of player behaviors and tactics that allows you to fully appreciate and inhabit your role as a stalker within the zone. I don't think it would be inaccurate to suggest that most people who play video games don't care too much about where they come from. They are designed to be intuitively easy to learn, with established conventions and transferable skills across different genres, styles, and modes of play. So long as it is able to be played and understood in the local language, good games are good games, no matter what their country of origin, right? Like every other entertainment industry, there are hundreds of competitors around the world fighting for the limited attention and money that consumers have to spend on video games. Most developers and publishers will obviously want to create their own brands that can find mainstream appeal, which will obviously take precedence over anything that might be perceived as too alienating for international audiences. Naturally, it leads to a kind of homogeneous quality in the marketplace that favors repetition and familiarity in the kind of games that get made, not only in well-worn genres and design cliches, but also in the characters, stories, settings, and themes that, more often than not, frequently draw from the same North American reference points as all the rest. Thus, I find it fascinating when video games try to say something specific and personal that speaks to developers as much as it does to the player. When a developer decides to embrace diversity and difference, drawing from the places, the language, the culture, and the history of a community they consider themselves a part of. Whether it means indulging in its material culture of art and architecture, integrating history and folklore into the gameplay experience, or even simply enveloping the player in the rhythms of a foreign language being spoken. That kind of commitment on the part of the designers, the writers, the artists, the composers, and everybody else involved in its creation brings up interesting questions. What does it mean to say that a video game could be representative of a particular national identity? What impact does it have when a developer wants to involve parts of themselves in their work? What do they want to talk about when they talk about themselves? While GSC obviously chose the Chernobyl exclusion zone in part for its international brand recognition, I think that the ways in which its setting is represented calls to something more significant than merely sensationalizing a national tragedy. Senior developers at GSC took multiple trips to the exclusion zone, not only to take hundreds of reference photos, but also to personally experience the desolation of the zone firsthand. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant is only 100 kilometers away from the capital city of Kiev, where many of the developers had grown up during the disaster. And, according to senior PR manager Oleg Yavorsky, even some of their parents had once worked as liquidators, risking their health and their lives to clean up the contaminated areas. And beyond that, the long shadows of Chernobyl still loom large over Ukraine today, not only in the radioactive isotopes still lurking within the exclusion zone, but also in how the disaster left its impact on Ukrainian society. Before Chernobyl, nuclear energy was seen by many Ukrainian intellectuals as a positive force that was uplifting the nation into modernization, harnessing the peaceful atom for the benefit of mankind. However, even though Ukraine received electricity from these nuclear power plants, regional officials had little to no influence in decisions over its operation. Nuclear energy was under the direct control of the Ministry of Media Machine Building in Moscow, with most of the skilled personnel and management being appointed from outside Ukraine. Modernization, as it often had throughout Soviet history, came with the imposition of a foreign Russian government, economy, language, and culture under the guise of socialist unity. And now that the land and the people had been poisoned by that modernization, many saw Chernobyl as not merely an industrial accident, but a symptom of the deadly dysfunction of the imperialistic Soviet system that had failed to serve or even protect them. For Mikhail Gorbachev, the last General Secretary of the Soviet Union, Chernobyl demonstrated to him that the old ways of doing things could not last. The stagnant economy had long been suffering from chronic corruption and frequent shortages of basic goods. An unpopular war in Afghanistan going on 5 years was continuing to be lost, and now a combination of bad procedure, human error, and critical design flaws had caused a global nuclear disaster. Gorbachev later stated on the 20th anniversary of the disaster that it was, quote, perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union 5 years later. Indeed, the Chernobyl catastrophe was a historic turning point. There was the era before the disaster, and there is the very different era that has followed, end quote. He felt that immediate and radical reform was necessary in order to revitalize the country. Spurred on by Chernobyl, Gorbachev accelerated his reforms throughout the late 1980s, which introduced policies like government transparency, market economics, and freedom of speech in the hopes of encouraging institutional change from the bottom up. But while Gorbachev made these reforms with the best intentions for his country, it would ironically help set in motion the last years of communism in Europe. At the 19th All-Union Communist Party Conference held from June 28th to July 1st, 1988, Boris Olenek, on behalf of the Writers' Union of Ukraine, brought a petition signed by 6,000 people that called for a moratorium on the construction of any new nuclear power plants in Ukraine, particularly one located near the former Cossack capital of Chechnya that stood as a symbol of Ukrainian history and culture. Quote, the arrogance and scorn of some all-union agencies, with regard to the fate of Ukraine, verged not only in some kind of merciless cruelty, but also on an insult to national dignity, end quote. In addition, he also called for the criminal prosecution of those responsible for establishing these flawed nuclear reactors on Ukrainian soil. Quote, I recall how, demanding the construction of the Chernobyl atomic energy station, some would often say that it was so safe you could install a reactor under the bed of newlyweds. We shall not demean ourselves by recommending that the mockers place their beds beside reactor number 4, but we have the right to demand that the designers who committed the gravest miscalculations in choosing sites for atomic energy stations in Ukraine be held personally responsible." End quote. Openly criticizing party officials and the state apparatus on the podium in front of 5,000 Soviet delegates would have previously been impossible, but the liberal reforms ushered in by Gorbachev meant that everything and everyone, including responsibility for the Chernobyl disaster, was fair game for public discussion. Later that year, on November 13th, Dr. Yuri Sherbak, an acclaimed epidemiologist and environmentalist, hosted a public demonstration on the Maidan in downtown Kiev, which became the first unauthorized mass protest in Soviet Ukrainian history, with an estimated 10,000 people in attendance. The speakers seized the opportunity to criticize the negligence and secrecy within the Soviet Union that had allowed the Chernobyl disaster to happen, and the massive consequences upon the environment and public health. Furthermore, they also supported the creation of a popular front in solidarity with those emerging in the Baltic republics like Lithuania and Latvia to demand political change. 10 days after the demonstration, Sherbak joined together with other writer activists like Oles Honchar and Ivan Drak in the creation of the People's Movement of Ukraine, commonly nicknamed as the RUK. It would soon become the largest political organization in Ukraine, whose activism would focus on a wide range of issues, including Ukrainian nationalism, democratization, social justice, economic reform, and especially anti-nuclear environmentalism. Drak, who served as its first chairman, later declared that, quote, "Chernobyl was the stimulus of all the democratic processes in Ukraine, Polish solidarity the example, and the Writers' Union the cradle," end quote. Their momentum would lead the RUK to form the first official opposition to the Communist Party of Ukraine in the relatively free 1990 elections to the Supreme Soviet. Together with other non-communist parties, the RUK would generate the popular support necessary to push Ukraine towards total independence from the Soviet Union on August 24, 1991. Over the next 4 months, the rest of the republics from Moldova to Russia to Armenia and Tajikistan began declaring their independence until the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formally dissolved on December 26 that year. But while the West celebrated the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, for Ukraine and the rest of the post-Soviet republics, the 1990s would mark the grueling era of reconstruction. The communist welfare state that had once guaranteed education, employment, healthcare, and housing was virtually destroyed as Ukraine transitioned into a capitalist economy. As state-owned enterprises were being privatized, a small number of oligarchs accumulated massive fortunes and exercised significant corruption within the political and economic institutions of the country. And all the while, Ukraine still had to rely heavily on its remaining nuclear reactors at Chernobyl to supply its electricity needs. It took millions of dollars in foreign aid to relieve pressure on Ukraine to finally decommission the entire plant in the year 2000. While the official Soviet record only lists 31 deaths from the immediate explosion and acute radiation syndrome, nobody knows exactly how many victims the disaster created. Radionuclides like cesium-137 and iodine-131 were deposited into the air that people breathed, the water that people drank, and the earth that people grew their food in. The total estimates range wildly from 4,000 to 93,000 casualties across Europe, who were directly and indirectly affected through radiation-induced cancers, chronic illnesses, and reduced life expectancies. Even 36 years after the disaster, the Chernobyl exclusion zone is expected to remain uninhabitable for hundreds or perhaps tens of thousands of years, where generations of people who haven't even been born yet will have to shoulder the responsibilities of Chernobyl. Of course, there are no straight lines or simple answers in history. The Ukraine that we know today is a myriad of events, actors, motivations, and circumstances stretching across hundreds of years. But Chernobyl forever changed how people thought about their country, how they thought about themselves, and how they ought to live their lives afterwards. It helped lead to the creation of an independent Ukrainian state that was able to speak its own language, to develop its own culture, and to choose their own form of government on the land that they lived on. For better and for worse, life in Ukraine is more complicated now than it was before, but it is a life that is free to go anywhere and to do anything. While the trilogy may have been heavily inspired by the S.T.A.L.K.E.R brothers and Andrei Tarkovsky, it is this historical setting, encapsulating the experiences of millions of people who lived, died, and suffered through it, that Stalker wants to immerse you into. There is an undeniable surreal atmosphere about the zone, balancing on the edge of reality and fantasy, that only makes the inclusion of supernatural phenomena and mutants seem all the more plausible. Of what Chernobyl, taken to its ultimate conclusion, could possibly become. Whereas Roadside Picnic and Tarkovsky's Stalker both theorized the zone was the aftermath of an unseen alien visitation, the Stalker trilogy suggests that its origin is far more human in nature. They explain that since 1989, Soviet scientists have been using the abandoned Chernobyl nuclear power plant as a secret laboratory to study the noosphere, a metaphysical field comprising the collective psyche of all humanity on Earth. They hold by that altering the noosphere, they could create a utopian world by eliminating negative emotions like anger, greed, and cruelty. But because individuals are too small to affect the noosphere themselves, 7 scientists volunteered to meld their minds together and form the Sea Consciousness. However, in meddling with forces beyond their comprehension, they accidentally tore the noosphere open and created the Zone, a physical manifestation of the psychic energies of Earth that has corrupted the natural order of reality. While they tried desperately to contain the Zone that was creating violent anomalies and mutants, the Sea Consciousness created the Wish Granter and the Brain Scorcher, myths to lure stalkers deep into the Zone with fantastical promises of wealth, power, and happiness, and then brainwashing them either into zombies or devout soldiers willing to die to defend the Sea Consciousness from the outside world. Despite this, hundreds of stalkers continue to illegally trespass into the Zone, and opposing factions have emerged to try to determine its ultimate fate. The militaristic duty views the Zone as an existential threat and is determined to destroy it at all costs, while the anarchic freedom wants to preserve its sovereignty for the collective heritage of humanity. Monolith is dedicated to worshipping and violently defending its fabled center. Bandits regularly cheat and kill anybody in their way, and for those stalkers caught in the middle, most simply want to profit from its mysterious artifacts. But the truth is, no one can understand the Zone, let alone try to control or destroy it. It is unknowable, all-powerful, and deadly to all those who don't respect its rules. But while life is hard and death is common, there still exists a stable community and a way of life in the Zone. Stalkers eat sausages and drink vodka in the abandoned warehouses and bus shelters that they call home. They share hilarious jokes and tales of adventure over the crackling of a campfire. Many stalkers have come to escape the confines of civilization, and have found a new world full of mystery, beauty, and freedom. The Zone in Stalker holds a complicated legacy that can't be easily thrown away. It will probably be around so long as human beings are around, and for better and for worse, there is no going back. With this chapter, I don't mean to exoticize cultural differences, or to suggest that the depressing post-Soviet aesthetic is somehow the defining quality of the Ukrainian or Eastern European identity. Rather, I want to remark upon all the history, the politics, the memory, and the culture that lies within the heart and soul of Stalker, and how it made my immersion into the trilogy that much stronger. As a virtually unknown studio in Ukraine with only real-time strategy games to their name, GSC Game World had to deliberately overhype Stalker in order to break out from the crowd and achieve their first blockbuster hit. They made overly ambitious promises of dynamic interactivity and limitless open worlds that would be extremely difficult even for the most experienced and resourceful of studios. And with the expenses and limitations of licensing third-party game engines at the time, GSC also decided to develop their own state-of-the-art 3D game engine from scratch, while simultaneously laying down the foundations for the game. Once development was fully underway in 2002, their naive idealism soon gave way to a 5-year-long cycle of trial and error as they tried to get the scope of the game under control from what they initially promised. Huge portions of Shadow of Chernobyl, including anomalies, mutants, factions, vehicles, storylines, mechanics, and levels, were either cut or repurposed for the sequels that followed. In their determination to push the bleeding edge of interactive entertainment, Stalker endured years of grueling crunch and tough compromises in order for the game to ever see the light of day. Those who didn't quit or weren't fired from the studio would have to quickly develop Clear Sky and Call of Pripyat within a year of each other in order to recoup their substantial development costs. And in spite of the critical acclaim and moderate commercial success of the trilogy, it was not enough to stop the CEO from suddenly dissolving GSC Game World in 2012, thereby cancelling Stalker 2 and leaving its former employees to restart their careers elsewhere. But while the trilogy may not have necessarily transformed GSC into industry legends or turned their games into genre-defining classics, I think that they have achieved their own worthwhile legacy. When Shadow of Chernobyl was finally released in 2007, GSC found themselves riding the wave of what would be fondly remembered as a golden year for video games. As the 7th generation of HD home consoles finally found its footing, dozens of games emerged with new designs, technologies, and innovations that set new standards for the global industry. Shooters, RPGs, platformers, action-adventures, racers, and even rhythm games would all find popular representation in 2007. And beyond the realms of industry giants like Japan and the United States, developers in Central and Eastern Europe would also find mainstream success and make themselves known on the international stage. CD Projekt would transform from a local Polish game distributor to one of the most acclaimed video game companies in the world, due in no small part to the success of The Witcher. Crytek in Germany would achieve notoriety with the release of Crysis, which boasted vast sandbox levels and the most impressive graphical fidelity on PCs that couldn't be found anywhere else in the market. And Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl, made by GSC Game World, would prove that Ukraine was capable of creating AAA quality games that could compete with the best of the best. It expanded GSC into becoming the largest video game company in Eastern Europe at the time, and, since its reopening in 2014, continues to be a major employer for the Ukrainian video game industry. To this day, Stalker remains one of the most well-known video games to come out of Ukraine, second perhaps only to the Metro Trilogy, and it shows in how it has retained a passionate cult following all over the world. Modders will continue to keep the games relevant for years after its heyday, creating hundreds of free mods for the trilogy like texture packs, engine overhauls, and gameplay additions. There are even standalone mods like Call of Chernobyl and Anomaly that are almost entire games unto themselves, encompassing every single map, asset, and mechanic release to date, while adding their own innovations to the Stalker formula. And despite the temporary death of the franchise for over a decade, spiritual successors would emerge within Ukraine and abroad that would carry on its immersive design philosophy. Games like Chernobylite by the Farm 51 in Poland, with its photorealistic 3D scanned environments, the physicality and interactivity afforded by virtual reality in Into the Radius by the Estonian studio Creative Mobile Games, and the aforementioned Metro Trilogy by former Stalker developers at 4A Games with its supreme attention to detail and atmosphere, including the non-linear level design found later on in Metro Exodus. Stalker caught my attention precisely because it provided a gaming experience that was rough and uncomfortable, yet incredibly enthralling and ambitious for its time. It captured that vivid sense of immersion and atmosphere that I long for in gaming. With its dynamic NPC ecosystems, its melancholic open world, its unforgiving survival and combat mechanics, and an authentic narrative setting unlike many of its contemporaries. When Stalker 2: Heart of Chernobyl is inevitably released to the world, it will be noteworthy in more ways than one, not only for ending the decade-long hiatus of the series, or being among the few games in history to be developed within an active conflict zone, but also for its console debut on the Xbox Series X and S that will introduce Stalker to a brand new generation of gaming. With the significant advancements in design and technology in the years since Call of Pripyat, GSC has the opportunity to pick up what their predecessors had left behind in Chernobyl, and to go further than was previously thought possible. But while Stalker moves firmly towards the future, the original trilogy will nevertheless persist as a unique vision on what immersion can be and how dramatically it can transform the interactive experience. Video games really are special things. They are meticulously designed pieces of software, incorporating art, design, literature, film, music, and more, within a set of algorithmic rules and procedures. By interacting with video games, they can communicate ideas, feelings, and worldviews in ways that are unlike any other medium in human history. They can allow us to explore incredible virtual worlds, subjectively identify with its narrative themes, or master the depth and flow of its mechanics. While immersion is often described as a suspension of disbelief, we can extend that definition to mean the closing of the figurative distance between the player and the game, the flow state that eliminates all the artificiality, the distractions, and the contrivances to create a sincere and intimate dialogue. Immersion allows players and developers to synchronize and connect with each other, and to understand what makes video games so powerful to billions of people around the world. And for that, for me at least, Stalker most definitely lived up to the hype.